Sa palagay ko, magkapareho ang nararamdaman natin ngayon. Agam-agam, pagkabalisa, pag-aalala, malamang galit, at kawalan ng pag-asa. We find ourselves puzzled at policies being made. We wonder, why do some policies worsen rather than ease the problems we face? And it seems that we are always at the mercy of powerful men and institutions. Hindi naman ito bago sa totoo lang. Mas damalang natin ang kawalan ng pag-asa dahil sa pandemya. Gayunpaman, hindi na ba talaga tayo makatitikim ng maayos na pamamahala? Bibihira na lang ba talaga ang matitinong leader ngayon? Hanggang dito na lang ba talaga tayo? Paano kung sasabihin kong may pag-asa pa? At abot kamay lang ang pagbabagong hinahangad natin. In this lecture, I would like to discuss local governance as a powerful but often overlooked source of hope today. Particularly, how important local political engagement is in creating more meaningful and long-lasting reforms for our community and our country. Let me begin with a personal story. In 2003, I visited the public elementary school in Barangay Payatas for our work in the Ateneo Center for Educational Development. 3 jeepney rides from Katipunan to Batasan and then finally to Payatas. I arrived at the edge of the dump site with no sign of a school. The principal, the late Sir Ben Kaling, was there at the roadside to greet me and led me through a small path. At the end of this pathway was the entrance to Payatas B Annex Elementary School, a very small school of 600 students with only 2 concrete classrooms, 3 makeshift ones, 1 toilet, and no running water. Sa puntong yon, tumakbo kaagad sa utak ko ang lahat ng posibleng problema. But, as I immersed myself in the school and the community, I realized that I had many wrong assumptions about the school and its problems. Why was attendance high, despite the lack of classrooms? Why were their teachers happy, despite having to teach in very poor conditions? Why did school administrators not request that they be transferred to a better school? It was simply because the community had each other's backs. Parents and teachers came together on weekends to fix broken chairs, tables, and the makeshift walls that were falling apart. On weekdays, they discussed the welfare of their children. These meetings transformed into school-based planning and eventually a multi-sectoral movement. Sir Kaling and the parents tirelessly lobbied for policies and resources from all sectors: the city government, small businesses, big corporations, civil society organizations, religious groups, and philanthropic institutions. It was then that I realized that reform is not so much a technical process that follows a one-size-fits-all template. It is an organic movement that begins with the inner desire of ordinary people to uplift the whole community. It is sustained by collective action and inclusive decision-making. Most importantly, reforms are led by the members of the community and not by outsiders or elites. Where does the reform journey begin? It starts with a clear understanding of governance. The Asian Development Bank and the United Nations Development Program define governance as the sound exercise of political, economic, and administrative authority to manage a country's resources and affairs. It involves not only the government, but also other institutions. These institutions facilitate the articulation of interests and allows citizens to have a voice on matters that are important to them. There are fundamental questions that we can ask ourselves to determine if governance is good or sound. First, are we able to hold our leaders accountable? O naniniwala ba tayo na ang lahat ng kanilang kapalpakan ay joke lang? Second, is the kind of governance being practiced participatory? Are ordinary citizens involved in the decision-making processes of the government? Third, are our institutions able to uphold the law? Are laws consistently and equally applied to everyone, regardless of wealth, status, or privilege? Fourth, is our government transparent? Is truthful information made available to the public on a regular basis? O baka naman, puro fake news lang ang ipinamumudmod sa ating lahat. Good governance and its principles are applicable to all levels of government. While there are different ways countries organize themselves, there are typically all divided into two levels: the government of the whole country and the government of the parts. I would like to focus on the government of the parts, or what we call local government, because in my experience, I find that the most meaningful reforms come from below. In the Philippines, local governments are subdivided into three levels of political units. At the topmost level, you have the provinces, independent cities, and highly urbanized cities. Under provinces are the municipalities and component cities. At the lowest level are the barangays, our basic political units. All LGUs enjoy local autonomy as provided for in our Constitution. Nonetheless, they are under the general supervision of the President. Regions are administrative in nature and therefore are not accorded with political representation, with the exception of the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao. Local autonomy is an important feature of our nationhood and democracy. Since pre-colonial times, local autonomy has assumed many forms. The present design is framed within Republic Act 7160, or the 1991 Local Government Code, which was authored by the late Senator Aquilino Pimentel Jr. This law aimed to transform LGUs into self-reliant communities and active partners in the attainment of national goals. The code reconfigured institutional arrangements to reflect a more democratic relationship between the center and the periphery. It has also brought about significant systems changes, particularly through devolution. Devolution, a form of decentralization, disperses the functions, power, authority, and responsibility away from the national government towards LGUs. Some important features of decentralization in the Philippines include: 1. The devolution of delivery of basic services such as health, agriculture, environment and natural resources, social services, and public works funded by local funds. 2. The transfer of some regulatory and licensing powers. 3. The increase in financial resources made available to local governments, including the transfer of a portion of nationally collected internal revenues to LGUs, known as the Internal Revenue Allotment or IRA. And 4, the direct participation of civil society in policymaking and local planning. Kung tutuusin, marami naman talagang pwedeng gawin ang mga lokal na pamahalaan upang mapabuti ang ating kalagayan. Over the last 30 years, in fact, many local governments thrive and maximize their potential through devolution. Even during this pandemic, there were innovative governance practices that emerged. For example, some LGUs were able to harness the power of technology to deliver critical health services such as telemedicine, mobile butika, e-reseta, and contact tracing apps. Others use indigenous knowledge and local resources to address the economic effects of the pandemic in a culturally sensitive and sustainable way. This includes crop sharing, vegetable gardening, backyard poultry raising, establishing a barangay-based barter system store, and mobile palenques. And then, of course, you have LGUs who delivered an entire system of support to communities. In Pasig City, the local government provided alternative modes of transportation to frontliners and citizens. A centralized monitoring and tracing system called Pasig Pass was implemented as well. And quarantine facilities were put in place to benefit the most vulnerable households. In public education, their approach was systemic. Tablets with preloaded modules were provided. An online multisectoral education summit was conducted together with Sinergia Foundation to plan for online learning, and free Wi-Fi and other learning materials were made available on a regular basis. While we celebrate these achievements, they are nonetheless islands, exceptions to the rule rather than the norm. So why then do some local governments thrive while others become worse? Isn't devolution supposed to lead to good governance? What attributes to the unevenness of the outcomes and impacts? Bakit nga ba iba-iba ang kinahinatnan ng mga lokal na pamahalaan? Kahit na pare-pareho ang saklaw ng kapangyarihang ibinigay sa kanila sa ilalim ng Local Government Code. In our political system, getting things done is the responsibility of the chief executive. At the local level, this core task is assumed by the mayor and the governor as head of the different executive departments. The executive branch is responsible for the implementation of policies and programs. So, while we can say that leadership is an important driver in closing this governance gap, we must remember too that getting things done encompasses the executive branch. In other words, hindi lamang pinuno, kundi pamunuan. Getting things done requires the support too of the local legislative branch, called the Sanggunian. These local councils, led by the vice mayor and the vice governor, are responsible for passing resolutions and ordinances. These include ensuring the effective delivery of basic services, efficient local governance, maximizing the use of local resources, and appropriating funds. It is composed of elected district representatives, appointed sectoral representatives, as well as ex-officio members, such as the president of the Liga ng mga Barangay, Sangguniang Kabataan, and the Local Councilors League. This structural division of local government into executive and legislative branches follows the separation of powers doctrine that promotes a healthy check and balance system. In practice, however, the role of the local chief executive has been broader as well as complex. As Andrew Haywood pointed out, our political executives perform several functions: ceremonial duties, policy making, management of the bureaucracy, popular leadership, and crisis response. In business as usual settings, doing good in one or two of these aspects may be enough for a mayor to secure a decent amount of support in the next local elections. Pero hindi na ito uubra ngayon. Local chief executives should now be good at all aspects of leadership. Being poor in one can lead to devastating consequences in the lives of people in the community. Stakes are higher, and so are our expectations. Leadership is a virtue, not a vice. We deserve better. I emphasize, however, that political participation does not end when an election winner is declared. We should make sure that we engage them fully. most especially through the formal political processes that are accorded to us as citizens. In the local school communities that I've worked with, sustained reform is usually caused by a shift in people's consciousness rather than just the leaders. I saw this in action in Payatas, when the parents lobbied the local government to build much-needed infrastructure through the Special Education Fund. I remember the PTA president telling me, akala namin imposible, pero kaya pala. Basta iisang boses kami kasama ng principal at teachers. Hindi naging sagabal ang kanilang estado sa buhay at antas ng pinag-aralan upang isulong ang kanilang mga pangarap para sa komunidad. Sila na ang nagkusa na maghanap ng agarang solusyon. Here we see how ordinary people are empowered when they make collective claims rather than depend on the good intentions of the mayor or governor. Indeed, this is the people's power. My experience working with the school communities in Payatas scarred me for life. I realized that while it is good to be angry at poor governance, we should consciously translate our frustration into constructive engagement. The balance of power between center and periphery, the government of the whole and the government of the parts, is shaped by historical, economic, political, cultural, and geographic factors. Regardless, the shift of power from the top to below in 1991 was intended not only to democratize our local political institutions, but also to empower us as members of our communities. But the truth remains, in most places, it was, and still is, the local elites that benefited from this shift. This goes against the very essence of devolution. It is repulsive that we depend on political dynasties for the continuation of policies and programs. Local power, or any power for that matter, should always be contested by a broad range of societal actors. Benjamin Goldfrank, in his study of Latin American local governments, asserts that national efforts to decentralize authority and resources is not enough. In order to deepen democracy, a strong institutionalized opposition at the local level is necessary. In next year's general elections, there will be a total of 16,041 seats that will be vied for at the provincial, city, and municipal level. This is approximately 50 times more compared to the total number of seats at the national level. Gayunpaman, ilan ba sa atin ang hindi sinasagutan ang bahaging ito ng balota? If we want to become a nation where good governance is the norm, we must engage and be critical of our leaders and political institutions. Reforms are strategic, but they should also be organic. Ultimately, we are the ones in control of our community's fate. This lecture is a reminder of our true power as citizens. Let us reacquaint ourselves with our local institutions. Get to know our neighbors and their aspirations. Organize our local community. Attend local government sessions. Engage with our local leaders. Reform should not be just a technical or policy strategy, but a political process that is influenced by the distribution and contestation of power. We should not be content with the existence of just a few excellent LGUs when there are so many others falling behind. Here I recall what the Japanese friend of former Ateneo de Manila University President Father Ben Nebres told him, that a society can only march as fast as its slower members. It has been 18 years since my first visit to Payatas. Since then, I've worked with countless public schools and LGUs. I've made many friends, some of whom I still keep in touch with. While we've made some progress in introducing reforms and empowering local communities, there is still a lot of work to be done. Great nations are built on the strength of their local communities and not the other way around. After all, it really takes a village to raise a country.